Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Tenho grande satisfação de dar-lhes as boas-vindas, mas eu acho que hoje nós vamos falar em inglês, porque não tem tradução.
Meu português não é muito bom,
Você entende?
mas eu entendo mais ou menos.
Tá bom. Não, nós vamos fazer em inglês. So I would like to welcome you to this meeting. It's a joint venture between FAPE, which is the Fundação Armando Alvares Pendeado, where I am a director, and the China-Brazil Business Council, where I am the chairman. And I am particularly pleased to welcome Larry Brainard among us this afternoon. This is one of the events the Business Council has been undertaking in recent months with the purpose to try to explain a little bit about China, but basically to talk and to discuss about China-Brazil relationship from the point of view of the business community. That's the main task and the main responsibility of the China-Brazil Business Council. We have organized a lecture by Professor Fembi, who is also one of the experts of trusted sources. We have had many presentations on one of our research, which was, by the way, directed by Professor Antonio Barros Castro, who died a few weeks ago, and this was a big loss for the Council and a big personal loss for the Council members like myself. We prepared recently this research on Chinese investments in Brazil, and now we are preparing a second research that you see on the cover of this publication, which is the Brazilian investments in China, which we expect to be completed by the end of this year. So today we have the Chief Economist and Managing Director of Trusted Sources, with whom we have been working for some time now, Larry Brainard, whom I had the opportunity and the pleasure of meeting some 30 years ago. Yeah. In a very different and difficult environment. In '88, I was the chief debt negotiator for Brazil. I negotiated $80 billion of Brazilian debt, $60 billion of debt to the private banks, and $20 billion of debt before the creditor countries at the Paris Club. The negotiation of the Brazilian debt was not an easy task. Indeed, we spent 9 months together. And our son was an agreement between Brazil and the creditor banks, and this agreement lasted for 9 months to be negotiated. So we used to meet very often. But I remember one fact, which is a lecture that Larry gave at the New York University. I don't know whether you remember that. It was a very interesting lecture in which you pointed out one specific thing, that the debt issue, the debt crisis, before being a technical and an economic issue, was a political issue on how to share the debt burden, the debt bill. And I remember always this sentence or this thought when I think about what's going on in Europe now, when a financial crisis became a fiscal crisis, and now it's a political crisis, because it's the sharing of the burden between Greece, I hope between Greece, because more countries may be part of this negotiation, the creditor governments, mainly Germany, and the banks. But we're not here to talk about the European crisis, we are here to talk about China. And trusted sources became an expert on the BRIC countries. This is a matter of huge interest for Brazil now. We received recently the visit by Ambassador Pimentel from Itamaraty, from the Institute for International Studies of Itamaraty, and we are going to pursue together a series of research and lectures on the BRIC countries. So I think you came at the right moment, and we'll very much hope to count on you more often on a more structured way to discuss the situation by the BRICS, where I understand trusted sources is an expert. I'm not going to talk about China, only to say that what we do at the Council now is to focus on China-Brazil relations. China became last year the first market for Brazilian exports. Trade between China and Brazil increased by 52% in 2010. That is an amazing number. And China became also the first investor in Brazil. It announced $18 billion of investment, out of which $12 billion were confirmed or formalized. But we have an expert here, the president of Bank of China. I would like, after your presentation, to have his confirmation and the prospects of that. So China is a very important partner for Brazil now, as first market, first investor, and China is at the same time a big opportunity for Brazil, because Brazil is an outstanding exporter of commodities, and China is an outstanding importer, but China at the same time is a big challenge. It's a big challenge for Brazilian industry. It is a big challenge for Brazilian exporters to export more to China. It's a big challenge in third markets. But I think we have many more information and analysis to get from Larry today. So I would like you to start and say that we are very interested, and I'm particularly pleased to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sergio. What I remember from those days back in 1987, 1988, when we were sitting around the table negotiating, is that we were working together to find a solution that had appropriate sharing of the burden. And what I sense now is that we made many mistakes. The banks made many mistakes starting from 1982. But I think we learned a lesson, and the most important thing today when I think of Greece is that countries cannot pay debt if they cannot grow. And that lesson doesn't seem to have been appreciated by some politicians in Europe. But let's focus on China. I'll talk for about 20 minutes, and then I'd like to invite your questions. So we can have a dialogue. The title of my presentation, China's Prospects in the Coming Economic Slowdown, What is Brazil's Stake? My message can be summarized very simply. If Brazil looks at the world today, what do they see? They look at the US, they see a country which is fallen into a debt problem, politically is in a mess, is not addressing its problems. If you look at Europe, what you see is another mess. And the message, the bottom line for Brazil is simply this, that China has become even more important for your economic future. And China's ability to continue to grow and to develop a relationship with Brazil is ever more important for Brazil's future, because you can't depend on the developed economies, what we call the developed economies, to get their act together very quickly. So that's why China is important. I'm going to talk first of all about the near-term outlook, the next 6 months. And if you read the newspaper, you can pick up a newspaper and you'll find some talking head that says, oh, China is going to collapse because exports are going to collapse, all kinds of gloom and doom. But if you look at the numbers and you focus on what's really going on, you don't see any signs of a slowdown in the short-term outlook. I've got a chart there of industrial production. You can see that industrial production is growing about 15%, quite steady. And we anticipate that growth will be a bit stronger in the second half because of an inventory cycle which is turning, and we expect to see a bit stronger growth as inventories are built up during the second half of the year. So for the year as a whole, we think growth will be quite strong, about 9 to 9.5%. If we look next year, of course, there will be an impact on China's exports from the slowdown in U.S. and slowdown in Western Europe. This year, we think that net exports, this is the economist term that they use to calculate GDP growth, net exports will be about 1 percentage point of the GDP growth. In 2012, we think that this will go to 0. So we think that growth will slow down next year, but there will still be a relatively strong growth. And the other event on the horizon is clearly the crisis in Europe and the Eurozone, which will have some impact on Chinese policy as we move into next year. We're not quite sure yet whether we'll see some fiscal stimulus. There might be some targeted fiscal stimulus, but overall we think growth will continue relatively strong. Now, what has been behind the growth in China? This is a chart which shows fixed asset investment. And China's very high investment rate has been a major factor. And what's interesting is that if we look at the red line, we have overall investment. And if we look at the dotted line, we have the real estate investment. And what's unusual and perhaps unexpected is that real estate investment has in fact been stronger overall than fixed asset investment. You see that real estate investment has been growing about 40% on a year-on-year basis. Our expectation is that property investment, real estate investment will continue quite strong. The government has launched a new program to increase what they call social housing, that is to provide lower income housing with a target this year of 10 million starts units. And that is a major factor that is supporting investment. Let's come to talk about some of the problems. Inflation is a problem in China, and if you look at the left-hand chart, you can see what's behind inflation. We have food, which is the top line, shooting up roughly a 15% inflation rate for food inflation. The red line is the CPI, which the latest figure was 6.2, and the lower line is for non-food. Inflation will be turning down in the coming 6 months because you can see on the food inflation is peaking and will probably come down to some extent. This is related largely to pork prices, which have increased about 50% this year. So that cycle will be turning, and we anticipate that inflation rate will fall from just over 6% to somewhere between 4.5% to 5%. If we look next year, we're not so optimistic that inflation will continue falling because we think the food inflation will continue in double digits. And this is a very important aspect of Chinese development because we all know that China is very competitive in manufactured exports. But in agriculture, it's much less competitive, and this is reflected in relatively high rates of food inflation. Of course, that from the Brazil perspective, that is an opportunity because Brazil is one of the most efficient producers of grains as well as meat. Monetary policy, a lot of debate among economists about what is going to happen with monetary policy. At the beginning of the year, if we look on the left-hand chart, we can see the growth, the red line, the growth of the bank loans. And we can see that during this year, from January, we can see that there's this very steady downtrend in the rate of growth of bank lending. And this is because the People's Bank of China, the PBOC, and the CBRC, which is the regulatory agency, have put very strong controls on lending. We have our friend from Bank of China. He can confirm that. So the banks do have quite strict control from the monetary authorities on lending, and lending is trending down. And despite concerns about potential impact of the global slowdown, our judgment is that monetary policy will remain relatively unchanged. We're not anticipating that there will be a relaxation of monetary policy to the end of the year. But we would emphasize that monetary policy is mostly affected through direct controls on bank lending rather than increasing of interest rates. Interest rates are very much a secondary factor in controlling monetary expansion, and we don't anticipate any further increases in interest rates. But we don't think that there will be a change in monetary policy until we come to December when there's the annual meeting. It's called the work conference at which the guidelines for the next year will be set. The big question mark is on trade. Clearly, the demand for Chinese exports will be moderating. If we look at the chart, what we see is that we see exports are growing at about 20%. The performance rate of expansion is moderating to some extent, but is still a very impressive export performance. Imports have also been very strong. The surplus, which is shown by the shaded area, has been relatively stable over the past year, about 175 billion surplus. We think that this will continue up until the end of this year, but as we move into